Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode I'm going to be looking at this Hornby Flying Scotsman that's been given to me to repair by a colleague of mine called Jason. Jason would like me to repair the cosmetic damage to this model, fully service it and also fit DCC sound with the decoder that he has supplied. The tender doesn't look too bad, and in the box is the sound decoder, and unfortunately one of the speaker wires has come adrift, so we'll have to repair that. But the actual loco part of the model is in quite bad shape. The body is loose from the chassis, the deflectors are missing, and on one side of the smoke box is a large amount of superglue bloom from where the model has been attempted to be repaired in the past. And you can see there just how bad that superglue has bloomed on the side of that model. So we'll have to rectify that later. There's also a bag of parts here, and Jason has asked me to fit the front footsteps, although the originals are missing, so the ones here are off a Gresley V2, which are very similar. Luckily enough, both deflectors are present, so we're going to have to devise a way of refitting these to the model, which I'll look at later. Now I'm going to attempt to give Scotsman a battery test. Now without connected to its tender, it was showing no signs of life at all. So I thought I'd connect the tender up to give it the best possible chance, and there were still no signs of life. Now this is an earlier Scotsman that Hornby released. The DCC interface is in the loco. The tender is used for pickup only, but there was no life in this model whatsoever. So I gently disconnect the tender. I'll just notice there's a driver and fireman in there. And undoing this screw at the front will release the chassis from the body shell. And once that screw's out of the way, the body shell lifts away, and then I see there's no DCC blanking plate in there. So that'd explain why it wasn't running. The circuitry is not complete. There is a loose wire there, and there's some chafed wires in here as well. So I'm going to have to address all this, because chafed wiring can touch the metal chassis and indeed cause a short circuit. But jacking the model up and testing the motor directly to the terminals via the battery connectors proves that the motor runs nicely and the drivetrain is complete and the wheels are turning nicely, so at least that's one thing. Initially, to fit sound to this, what I was going to do was fit a connector between the loco and the tender and have the sound unit in the tender. But that would have proved quite problematic, connecting the loco and tender up. I mean, removing the tender body shell, there's plenty of room in here for a sound decoder, although it is pretty solid and there's no holes in it to allow the sound to escape. So it was going to prove to be quite a job to fit sound in this model if it was to be located in the tender. Whilst I had the tender handy, I removed the base plate of the tender, just so that I could remove the wheels and service the pickups and clean all the wheels up. Jason's told me that he hasn't actually got a layout of his own at the moment, and this model has been in storage for many years. So I need to clean this all up to make sure that it is running and working in top condition for when he does eventually build his own layout. There wasn't much in the way of dirt in the tender, it was just dust and fluff, as per usual for a model that's not really had much use. Although I did clean the tender wheel sets and the wheel backs just as a matter of course, and in comparison to other models I've done on Trash to Track, there was virtually no dirt coming off these at all. The tender pickups were adjusted with my tweezer nose pliers, just to make sure that when the wheels are all back in place, that all the pickups are correctly touching the wheel backs. And this helps with good electrical conductivity, as there's no point in having pickups in the tender if they don't touch the wheel backs, because they'll be absolutely useless. So just testing it there with the tender wheels. These don't sit in any proper bearings, they just sit in the plastic holders. But once everything was cleaned and reassembled and all the pickups were adjusted, you can see there just how nice and shiny all those wheels are. That's the tender sorted, and now I'm going to look at fitting the sound to the actual loco drive part. Now this wire here will need sorting out, and I'm looking around to see what I can do regarding fitting the sound decoder to this model. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the DCC interface with these two screws here, And once this has been removed, this reveals another screw for an additional weight that sits in the front of the loco. Now, I had a word with a friend of mine about this, and he's installed sound in one of these locos before, and he advised to remove this weight and put the speaker in the decoder where the weight was. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here. So removing this weight using this small screw, having that weight removed really has made no difference to the weight of the model. It's negligible. It's not going to affect its running capabilities at all. So this looks like a good firm solution. Although I have now lost the bracket for the DCC interface. I'm just going to put some insulation tape over that screw there, just to make sure that nothing is in danger of short circuiting when I put this model back together. And I did try this with the decoder in the socket, but there just wasn't enough room. So what I've done is I've actually cut the socket away, and I'm going to hardwire this decoder into this Flying Scotsman. This is a relatively easy thing to do because there are no lights on this model. So using the old method that red and black goes to track and orange and grey the other way, I hardwire the red and black wires to the train pickups, orange and grey to the motor, and the speaker wires back to the speaker. I was going to upgrade the speaker in this model to that rectangular one you saw there, but it has to be a 100 ohm speaker as it is quite an old decoder, so I reverted to the round one. After I've soldered the decoder in place, I turned my attention to the body shell cosmetic damage. And using a small flat paintbrush and some rail match satin black, I'm going to repaint the smoke box area around where that super glue bloom was and see how it dries in regard to the other black paint around it. So working slowly with a soft brush, I touch in all the black paint that has gone white through super glue bloom, and then gently thin it and blend it in around the smoke box. There's also a small amount on the smoke box door which needs touching in as well. So I do this and then leave it to thoroughly dry overnight to see if you can tell where I've painted it, and you couldn't. It had dried exactly the same. As you can see there, you can't tell the difference. The method I devised for putting the deflectors back on, I drilled a 2mm hole. I drilled two 2mm holes in the smoke box side there, and then used 2mm plastic rodding and inserted it into the body shell, securing it with some plastic weld cement, and then cutting it down to size, ready to refit and use it as a bracket for the smoke deflectors. One of the deflectors had the original peg on it from Hornby, so I used this as a guide as to how deep those pegs had to be. Once I was satisfied that the pegs were the correct height, I painted them black, and the deflectors will then be reattached using some Loctite superglue, which in my experience doesn't give off the usual white bloom that's associated with superglue. So again, using the rail match satin black, I just touch those pegs in so that you can't actually see them. And then once the paint was dry, I will reattach the deflectors. Now, here's the speaker and the decoder in place. Now the speaker doesn't have a sound chamber to it, which makes the sound quite it isn't got a very high volume, which is unfortunate, but it's a needs must, and the sound will escape through the chimney there, so there's plenty of room for the sound to escape. I just haven't got a sound chamber on it, as there just physically isn't room in this model. To refit the chassis to the body shell, you engage a clip at the rear and then refit the screw under the smoke box, which we took out earlier on. Whoops, I just knocked the camera stand there, so excuse me for that. And then I tighten the screw up, and if that clip is engaged under the cab, all should be well. One thing I didn't have the footage for on this was when the chassis was apart from the body shell, I did open up the part that houses the motor worm, and I did apply some fresh lubrication to the worm gear and the drivetrain. I've also reattached the wire to that tender drawbar there, and Scotsman is starting to look the part. Now, using a battery on the terminals on the tender drawbar there, just to touch the brass, I'm just making sure that the model still works and that none of the wires have become trapped or have become loose. And once I can get those brass pickups to touch the terminals on the battery, I mean, I was cheating doing this, I should have done it properly, but once they were touching, you can see there that the wheels are turning nicely, which means that all the wires are where they should be. I'm just giving the tender wheels another clean. Once the tender had been reassembled, I'd actually sat it on some track that was coated in a film of old grease from another model that I was doing for Trash to Track, so I had to clean all this off. The grease had leaked onto the rails and it coated the wheels. But once that was done, I then clean all the wheels on the locomotive itself, starting with the pony wheel in the Katazi truck under the cab. And then using a battery on those tender drawbar terminals to get the wheels to turn, I first remove most of the excess dirt with a cotton bud of methylated spirits, and then polish the driving wheels up with a fiberglass pencil, including the wheel backs, and then one final polish with a cotton bud of methylated spirits to remove any of the fibres. And that is all the wheels on this Flying Scotsman, nice and clean, and I've removed the oxidisation from its years in storage. The decoder on this model doesn't really support DC. It does run, but as you can see here on the battery anyway, it runs at a very sluggish pace when it's on DC. But it was just enough to get the wheels to turn to clean them adequately. One other thing I noticed while the loco was upside down was that a couple of the rods had become bent at some point. So using my tweezer nose pliers, I just gently manipulate these back into the like straight, so that they're not catching each other when the wheels are rotating. And now everything's done, I'm in a position now where I can finally test the loco on a length of track using the battery. And when the decoder decides to fire up, you can see there that the model will run perfectly well without its tender pickups. Although it was a bit of an unfair test as there was no blanking plate when we did this earlier on. So now I'm just giving it the once over to make sure everything is in place and as it should be. And then I will refit those smoke deflectors. Now I left them till last because I really didn't want to attach the deflectors and then have to put the model back into the loco cradle and risk breaking them off again. Now that the loco is connected to its tender, I'm just giving it another test, and you can see there that it is running lovely and smoothly. And I really do find the Flying Scotsman in its apple green livery a really attractive locomotive to look at. Now the bag of bits that we looked at earlier, inside here as I mentioned was some front footsteps that originally came off a Gresley V2, but Jason wants me to fit them to Scotsman. The speedo drive needs refitting. There's a cab door that's come loose, so I'm going to refit this with a very, very tiny amount of super glue. So I basically decant some super glue onto a piece of plastic, attach some to the door using a cocktail stick, and then with my tweezer nose pliers I hold it in place until the glue sets. There really is the tiniest amount of glue on this because I don't want to risk putting any sort of super glue bloom onto that lovely apple green livery, because that would involve a lot more than just painting some satin black on it. And you can see there just how quick that super glue gripped and set. So now I'm going to start with the deflector, and I'm going to put a tiny amount of super glue on the existing Hornby pins and then onto the two lugs that I have put onto the model. And then again, the deflector was put in place, correctly lined up, making sure that it was level and straight, and then held in place until the super glue held. And one deflector was done and then left to thoroughly harden for 12 hours, or in this case I left it overnight. And then I tackled the other deflector just to make sure that the deflector was thoroughly on and the glue had thoroughly hardened before attempting to do the other one. The less super glue on this model the better, and I didn't want to risk doing it too quickly. So that's the Scotsman with one of its deflectors on, and now we'll have a look at her running on the layout with both done, having been fully rebuilt and DCC fitted. If you've got a loco you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Track, please email me at dansmodelrailways@gmail.com and we'll have a look at getting it sent over, repaired, and it may even feature in an episode all of its own. I'm going to leave you now with Scotsman running around the layout on a rail tour with some blue and grey Mark 1s. Thank you so much for watching Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you again in the next video. Bye for now.